The mahogany table in the executive suite on the 54th floor didn't just reflect the recessed halogen lights. It mirrored the absolute decay of my family. I slid the 200-page document across the polished wood. The paper was heavy 24-pound linen bond, the kind of texture that commanded respect in federal courtrooms. It made a soft scraping sound against the veneer, the only sound in a room that felt as sterile as a morgue. "Sign on page 198, I said. My voice didn't shake. It was a flat, dead monotone, honed by a decade of managing capital distributions for Hardin Logistics. "Both of you." Across from me sat Meredith, my stepmother, wearing a black Chanel suit that cost more than a paralegal's annual salary. Her neck was wrapped in South Sea pearls, hiding the slight slackness of a woman terrified of aging out of her tax bracket. Next to her was Garrison, my half-brother, 26, a Wharton dropout with a cocaine twitch in his left jaw, and a Patek Philippe on his wrist that he hadn't earned. Meredith didn't look at the document. She looked at me. She picked up her porcelain cup of Earl Grey, the gold rims clinking against her saucer with a sharp metallic ring. "Thank you for being so compliant, Cressida," she said. Her tone was like spun sugar laced with arsenic, the trademark upper-class Boston drawl she used when she wanted to remind me I didn't belong. "Your father's blood may have been elite, but your mother's secretarial DNA always did show in your eagerness to please. You know your place. I respect that." I didn't blink. I didn't let my knuckles whiten against my Montblanc pen. Instead, I let my gaze linger on the oil painting of my father, Pierce Hardin, hanging on the far wall. 72 hours. That was how long he had been in the ground at Cave Hill Cemetery. The scent of the funeral lilies was still trapped in the wool of my black blazer. He had died of a sudden, massive stroke in his study, isolated, surrounded only by Meredith's hand-picked medical staff who conveniently forgot to administer his blood thinners for a week. I knew it. They knew I knew it. But in the state of New York, suspicion doesn't hold up in probate court without a paper trail. Garrison grabbed the heavy silver pen, his fingers trembling with an impatience that disgusted me. He flicked through the pages, his eyes darting across the columns of figures. $80 million. That was the magic number. It was the entire liquid reserve of the Hardin Charitable Trust, money meant for cancer research facilities across the tri-state area. These two wanted to siphon it into an offshore vehicle, a shell company registered in Delaware called Apex Horizons LLC, before the official execution of the primary estate next month. "This is completely airtight, right, Vance?" Garrison mumbled, looking over his shoulder at Arlo Vance, the senior partner of Vance and Associates, who stood near the tinted glass windows. Vance was a fixer, the kind of high-priced white-collar cleaner who knew exactly which judges played golf at which country clubs. He adjusted his silk tie, his smile practiced and entirely devoid of human warmth. "The restructuring paperwork is immaculate, young man. Under the guise of an emergency capital reallocation dividend, the transfer bypasses standard SEC red tape. It's a clean sweep." Meredith smiled, a slow predatory curving of her perfectly lined lips. "They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought because they had cut off my corporate credit lines yesterday and threatened to smear my name with fabricated audit discrepancies across Wall Street, I was giving up. They were the textbook definition of greedy heirs, impatient, short-sighted, and utterly blinded by the glare of nine-figure bank balances. They viewed the family empire not as a legacy to protect, but as a carcass to pick clean before the vultures from the IRS arrived. People look at modern tragedies and expect the messy drama of cheap revenge stories. I thought to myself, watching Garrison's pen hover over the signature line. Hollywood cliches with screaming matches, shattered wine glasses, and dramatic slaps in the rain. They don't understand that real violence in the financial district happens in absolute silence. It happens with a stroke of ink on a legal instrument. "We need your co-signature as the designated trustee, Cressida," Meredith reminded me, her voice dropping an octave, becoming cold, sharp, and commanding. "Don't get sentimental now. Your father is gone. The board answers to my shares. If you want to keep your penthouse on Park Avenue, you will sign that authorization form. Otherwise, well, I've already drafted the press release detailing your gross financial negligence during the Q3 reporting cycle." A long pause hung in the humid air of the boardroom. The central AC hummed, a low vibration that rattled the window panes. Outside, a gray Manhattan rain was beginning to blur the skyline. "I'm not sentimental, Meredith," I said softly. I reached out and turned the page for Garrison, pointing directly to the line marked Authorized Transfer. "In fact, I agree with you. Why stop at 80 million? If we're going to restructure the trust's liquid reserves, we should clear out the secondary bond portfolios in Zurich as well. Let's make it around 105. Garrison stopped. His head snapped up, his eyes widening with raw, unadulterated avarice. "You can clear the Zurich accounts without a full board vote? As CFO, I have unilateral discretion over foreign secondary bonds if the transfer is classified as an operational emergency," I replied, my voice smooth, steady, completely convincing. I looked Vance straight in the eye. "Isn't that right, counselor?" Vance hesitated for a fraction of a second, his legal instincts tingling, but the sheer volume of the transaction, and his 5% cut, silenced his caution. "Technically, yes. If the CFO signs the emergency waiver, it's legally binding within 24 hours. "Excellent," Meredith breathed, her fingers tightening around her pearls. The trap was baited with pure gold, and she was already salivating. "Do it, Cressida." I leaned back in my leather chair, letting my hands rest flat on the table. My skin was cold, but my mind was operating at a fever pitch, calculating every variable, every statute of limitation, every federal threshold. They didn't see the tiny black lens camouflaged within the brass frame of the oil painting behind me. They didn't know that 3 miles downtown, in a high-security conference room at the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, a federal prosecutor and the chief legal counsel for the probate court were watching this room via an encrypted livestream. Every word spoken, every threat made, every admission of intent to divert charitable funds for personal gain. Recorded. Timestamps locked. "Sign it, Garrison," Meredith ordered, her eyes locked on mine, gloating in what she believed was her ultimate victory over her husband's bastard daughter. "Let's finish this." Garrison pressed the silver nib to the paper. The ink flowed. Black. Indelible. The first domino had just been pushed, and the fall would be catastrophic. The ink from Garrison's Montblanc pen sank into the linen paper, a dark, permanent stain. He lifted the nib with a sharp flick, his chest rising and falling with a shallow, panicked breath. He looked like a man who had just pulled off a bank heist and couldn't quite believe the vault door had remained open. Arlo Vance leaned forward, his large, manicured hand descending on the document like a hawk pinning its prey. He turned the page, verified the signature against the corporate seal, and let out a dry, satisfied grunt. He didn't blow on the ink. Modern legal ink didn't need it. He simply closed the leather binder with a heavy, final thud that echoed off the mahogany walls. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The faux deferential politeness Vance had maintained for the past hour vanished, replaced by the cold, transactional efficiency of a liquidator. "Thank you, Cressida," Vance said, his voice dropping into a lower register, stripped of its professional warmth. He reached into his vintage alligator skin briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of cream-colored paper. It wasn't a corporate document. It was a formal notification on Vance and Associates' letterhead. "Now that the emergency reallocation is authorized, we need to address your current status with Hardin Logistics." I sat perfectly still. The leather of my executive chair felt cold against my back. "My status." Meredith set her porcelain cup down. The clink was louder this time, deliberate. She leaned back, crossing her legs, the silk of her skirt rustling with a sinister luxury. "Let's not play stupid, darling. It doesn't suit your mother's pedigree. You've served your purpose. You kept the gears turning while Pierce was declining. But the board requires a different direction now. A family direction." Garrison smirked, leaning back and propping his Tom Ford loafers onto the edge of the multi-million-dollar table. He didn't look like a Wharton dropout anymore. He looked like a landlord about to evict a squatter. "What my mother is trying to say is, you're done, sis. Effective at 5 p.m. today." Vance slid the single sheet of paper toward me. I didn't look down at it. I kept my eyes on. "Vance, this is a formal notice of summary suspension," Vance explained, his tone clinical, entirely detached. "Pending a forensic audit into the Q3 logistics distribution accounts, we've discovered discrepancies." Specifically, $48,000 in undocumented wire transfers to a secondary logistics supplier in Newark. A supplier whose corporate registry happens to tie back to a maiden name associated with your late mother. The lie was beautifully constructed. It was small enough to be believable, yet toxic enough to destroy a CFO's career on Wall Street permanently. $48,000 was couch change to harden logistics, but a fraudulent transfer to a deceased mother's relative? That was a blackball offense. I didn't authorize any such transfer, Arlo, I said, my voice maintaining its flat, even rhythm. And you know it. The paper trail says otherwise, Vance replied, tapping his gold signet ring against the table. Tap, tap, tap. And in my line of work, the paper trail is the only thing that has a soul. The compliance committee has already voted. Your corporate access tokens will be revoked in exactly 12 minutes. Your security clearance for the building is canceled. Furthermore, your personal accounts at Chase Manhattan. Right on cue, the phone in my lap vibrated. A brief, sharp haptic pulse. Then another. I didn't need to look at the screen. I knew what the notification said. Citibank Private Client Asset Alert. Access restricted. American Express Centurion. Line of credit suspended by corporate guarantor. They weren't just firing me. They were erasing me. They were stripping away my operational oxygen, cutting off my liquidity, and ensuring I wouldn't have the financial resources to hire a top-tier white-collar defense attorney to fight the smear campaign they had already launched. We aren't monsters, Cressida, Meredith said, her voice dripping with that unbearable high society condescension. She adjusted a diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. We understand this is an emotional week for you. Your father's death. It's taken a toll. If you sign the voluntary resignation waiver and hand over your keys to the Park Avenue apartment by midnight, we will decline to file the formal police report regarding the Newark transfers. We'll let you keep your dignity. What's left of it? Garrison chuckled, a wet, unrefined sound. Think of it as a severance package. You get to walk away without an orange jumpsuit. You can go back to whatever burrow your mother crawled out of. Maybe open a boutique. Something more your speed. The cruelty in the room was palpable, thick enough to choke on. They had planned this down to the minute. The funeral was Tuesday. The asset diversion was Thursday morning. The execution of the bastard daughter was Thursday afternoon. They had used my grief as a shield, assuming I would be too numb, too broken by my father's sudden death to notice the legal noose they were tightening around my neck. But the physical frustrated, the raw, suffocating sense of injustice, didn't paralyze me. Solidified. It became a cold, heavy mass in my stomach, anchoring me to the floor. I looked at Meredith's flawless frozen face. I remembered 3 months ago, standing outside my father's private wing at the New York Presbyterian Hospital. I had arrived early, carrying a folder of international shipping manifests he wanted to review. Through the heavy oak door, I had heard her voice, not the sweet, doting tone she used when the doctors were in the room, but a sharp, rhythmic hiss. Just sign the proxy, Pierce. The girl doesn't care about you. She's already talking to the board about a mental competency hearing. She wants you in a home. My father had been too weak to fight back. The strokes had stolen his speech, leaving him trapped inside his own brilliant mind, at the mercy of a woman who viewed his body as nothing more than a biohazard standing between her and his estate. She had systematically replaced his private nurses with agencies owned by her cousins. She had restricted my visiting hours to 20 minutes a day, always under the watchful eye of Arlo Vance's paralegals. They had begun the murder of his dignity long before his heart finally stopped beating. Every gesture of affection Meredith had ever shown me over the last 10 years, every family Thanksgiving at the estate in Connecticut, every birthday card. It had all been a long-con orchestration. A grand theatrical performance designed to keep Pierce hardened complacent until the asset structures could be modified. You've been planning the Newark discrepancy for months, haven't you, Arlo? I asked, turning my gaze back to the lawyer. Vance didn't deny it. He didn't accept it either. He merely checked his Breguet pocket watch. 9 minutes, Cressida. The security team from Apex Guards is already downstairs with a cardboard box for your desk. I suggest you don't make a scene. The building has a lot of windows, and the street level is always full of photographers. A scene, I murmured. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. The linen paper of the transfer agreement was mere inches from my hands. No. I won't make a scene. Good, Meredith said, standing up and smoothing the front of her Chanel jacket. Garrison, call the driver. Let's get out of this rain. We have a dinner reservation at Le Bernardin with the chairman of the Port Authority. Wait, I said. The word wasn't loud, but it possessed a weight that made Garrison freeze with his phone halfway to his ear. I reached down into my leather briefcase, my fingers brushing against the cold, metallic edge of an old, encrypted USB drive I had retrieved from my father's private safe before they changed the locks on the Greenwich house. My heart was beating at a steady 54 beats per minute. Clinical. Controlled. Before you leave for dinner, Meredith, I said, looking up, letting a tiny, almost imperceptible shadow of a broken smile touch the corners of my lips. We need to talk about the Zurich secondary bonds. If you're going to take the 80 million from the trust, you might as well take the remaining 25 million from the Swiss accounts today. Why wait for the probate judge next month? Vance stopped mid-motion, his briefcase half-zipped. His legal mind, trained to detect desperation, sensed a trap, but his eyes drifted back to the wet ink on the transfer document. The sheer velocity of the wealth they were capturing was intoxicating. The Zurich bonds are under a separate covenant, Vance said, his voice tightening with a mixture of suspicion and greed. They require a physical authorization token from the primary trustee. I have the token, I whispered, reaching into my pocket. I could see the calculation happening behind Meredith's eyes. She didn't just want me gone. She wanted everything. She wanted the total absolute extraction of every cent Pierce Harden had ever touched. The sight of me sitting there, seemingly broken, stripped of my accounts, offering up the final keys to the kingdom out of sheer survival instinct, it was the ultimate validation of her power. Sit down, Garrison, Meredith commanded softly. Her eyes locked on mine like a cat watching a mouse offer itself up as a meal. Let's hear what the secretary's daughter has to say. Garrison's loafers hit the floor with a dull, heavy thud. He pulled his phone away from his ear, his thumb hovering over the screen, his eyes locked on me. The greed in his expression wasn't even hidden anymore. It was raw, visceral. It was the look of a degenerate gambler who just saw a forgotten stack of chips on the edge of the table. Meredith didn't sit back down immediately. She stood by her chair, her hand resting on the backrest, her manicured nails digging into the soft Italian leather. The Zurich secondary bonds, she repeated, her voice dropping into a low, predatory purr. Pierce told me those were locked until the probate court cleared the primary estate. They were, I said. My voice remained small, hesitant. The perfect imitation of a woman whose spirit had just been broken. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a matte black, military-grade Kingston encrypted USB drive. The zinc alloy casing felt freezing against my palm. But my father signed a cross-border clearing waiver 4 months ago. He wanted the liquidity available in case the shipping terminal expansion in Newark required emergency capital. He never told you because, well, he knew you'd want to use it for the Greenwich estate renovations. Meredith's eyes narrowed, a flash of old resentment crossing her face before being completely swallowed by avarice. Where is the authorization code? Right here, I murmured, tapping the drive against the mahogany table. Click, click. The sound was crisp, rhythmic. I can upload the routing sequence directly into the primary transfer document Arlo just drafted. But I want a guarantee, Meredith. A real one. Arlo Vance leaned in, his eyes darting between the USB drive and my face. A seasoned white-collar defense attorney can smell a setup from a mile away. But Vance had a fatal flaw. He was billing at $2,000 an hour, plus a 5% cut of the Apex Horizons diversion. 25 million more meant another $1.25 million in his private Swiss account. His legal caution surrendered to his mathematics. What kind of guarantee, Cressida? Vance asked, his pen already poised over his legal pad. I sign the Zurich waiver and you destroy the fake Newark audit files, I said, looking directly at Meredith, letting a bead of sweat trace down the side of my neck. A physical lie I forced my body to manufacture. You let me keep my name. I resign voluntarily. No press releases. No blackballing on Wall Street. And I keep the Park Avenue penthouse. It was my mother's before she married Pierce. You don't get to touch it. Meredith let out a soft, mocking laugh. She sat down, smoothing her skirt with an air of absolute triumph. The penthouse? That drafty old pre-war co-op? If that's the price for $25 million in liquid Swiss bonds, you can have it. Arlo, amend the separation agreement. Add the penthouse clause. Destroy the Newark file once the transfer clears. Understood, Vance said, his fingers flying across his encrypted Lenovo laptop. They thought they were watching a defeated girl scramble for scraps. They didn't know they were watching the execution of an executioner. 6 months ago, while my father was still capable of holding a pen without his hand shaking from the neurological cocktail Meredith's doctors were giving him, he called me to his private office in the middle of the night. He had a look of terrifying clarity in his eyes. He handed me this exact USB drive. They think I'm blind, Cressida, he had whispered, his voice raspy, broken by the early stages of his stroke. They think because I can't speak properly, I don't see the wire transfers. I don't see Arlo's shadows in my hallways. I've updated the irrevocable trust agreement. I filed it under a sealed docket in the New York Surrogates Court. It contains a forfeiture covenant. A bad boy clause. If Meredith or Garrison ever attempt a fraudulent conveyance, if they try to strip the assets of my charitable foundations, they don't just get sued. They legally forfeit every single dime of the main estate. It all goes to you. Every square inch of the company. Every dollar in the banks. The trap was already in the system. I just needed them to voluntarily walk into the vault and lock the door behind themselves. I slid the USB drive into the media terminal built into the center of the mahogany table. The boardroom's dual 80-inch monitors flickered to life. Rows of alphanumeric data began to cascade down the left screen. The secure ledger of the Zurich Union Bank, account ending in 9427. Look at the balance line, Arlo, I instructed, my finger pointing at the screen. Vance adjusted his glasses, his eyes widening. $25,412,611. All held in short-term sovereign treasury notes. Exactly, I said, navigating the interface with deliberate, steady strokes. Here was the first carrot. I didn't just show them the money, I showed them the vulnerability. Notice the routing restriction on line 12, I told Vance. The funds are currently flagged under a standard New York estate tax hold. If you transfer them directly to a personal account, the New York Department of Taxation and Finance gets an automatic digital trigger. They'll freeze the clearinghouse within 60 seconds. Vance frowned, his legal mind analyzing the obstacle. Then how do we move it without triggering the alert? We don't move it to a personal account, I said, leaning closer, smelling the expensive metallic scent of his cologne. We route it through the same Delaware entity Garrison just signed for, Apex Horizons LLC. But we have to classify it as a sovereign debt liquidation loan. Under Section July 1st, 11 of the State Financial Code, a corporate loan from a foreign secondary portfolio bypasses the automated probate trigger, provided the receiving entity has a single, designated managing member. Garrison leaned over Vance's shoulder, his breath smelling of stale espresso and nerves. Apex is registered under my name alone. I'm the sole managing member. I made sure of it. I looked at Garrison, giving him a look of manufactured jealousy. I know you did, Garrison. You didn't want Meredith having her name on the Delaware registry, did you? You wanted to make sure you controlled the liquidity once it hit American soil. Meredith's head snapped toward her son, her eyes flashing with a sudden vicious suspicion. What did you say? It's just for the tax structure, Ma. Garrison snapped quickly, a flush of crimson creeping up his throat. It's what Arlo advised. To keep it clean. We split it later, obviously. The fracture in their alliance was barely a hairline crack, but I knew exactly how much pressure to apply later. Greed of the greedy heirs was a volatile chemical. It required very little heat to explode. Let's keep our eyes on the clock, Vance interrupted, his professional veneer cracking under the stress of the numbers. The Swiss clearing market closes in exactly 22 minutes. If we want this integrated into the primary the primary transfer document, we need the cryptographic signature now, Cressida. I'm typing it now, I said. My fingers moved across the keyboard. Every keystroke wasn't routing money to Zurich. It was uploading the metadata of the transaction to the secure server of the Southern District of New York. The Fraudulent Conveyance Act under New York law is very specific. Intent is difficult to prove in a boardroom unless the parties explicitly acknowledge they are bypassing regulatory oversight. By asking Vance to structure the transfer as a sovereign debt liquidation loan, to bypass the probate trigger, they were committing a felony in real time. The system is requesting the secondary authentication, I said, pointing to a blinking red prompt on the screen. Security override required. Enter trustee fiduciary clearance code. Give it the code, Meredith demanded, her voice tight, her elegance completely replaced by a hard, clawing urgency. She had stepped away from her chair, standing right over my shoulder now. I could feel the heat radiating from her skin. If I enter this code, I said, pausing, looking up at her with an expression of pure, desperate supplication. You swear the Newark audit file is gone? You swear you won't touch my mother's penthouse? I give you my word as a harden, Meredith said without a single millisecond of hesitation. It was a worthless promise from a woman who had spent the last 5 years slowly erasing my father's life, but it was exactly what the federal prosecutors downtown needed to hear. Proved coercion. It proved extortion. It proved that my compliance wasn't voluntary. It was extorted under the threat of professional and financial ruin. All right, I whispered. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner built into the Kingston drive. The scanner glowed a deep neon green. A soft chime echoed through the boardroom speakers. On the screen, the red prompt dissolved, replaced by a green progress bar that began to climb from 0 to 100%. Transfer initiated. Zurich Global Custody to Apex Horizons LLC, Delaware. My God, Garrison whispered, his face lit by the blue glare of the monitor. It's actually happening. It's moving. 25 million, Meredith breathed, her fingers wrapping around her pearls so tightly the silk thread looked ready to snap. Plus the 80 million from the trust. Over $100 million. Clean. Not clean yet, Arlo Vance said, his voice sharp as a scalpel as he slammed his laptop shut. The wire takes 15 minutes to settle in the Delaware clearing account. We stay right here until the settlement notification prints out. Nobody leaves this room. Nobody uses their phone. I have no intention of leaving, Arlo, I said, pulling my hands away from the keyboard and folding them neatly in my lap. I leaned back into the leather chair, looking at the gray Manhattan rain lashing against the glass. The frustrated that had weighed down my chest for days was gone, replaced by a cold mathematical certainty. The clock on the wall read 4:42 p.m. In 18 minutes the trap would shut. The green progress bar on the dual 80-inch monitors crawled forward with agonizing deliberation. 42%. 43%. The hum of the server stack in the corner of the boardroom sounded like a distant, industrial heartbeat. Arlo Vance sat rigid, his fingers tense beneath his chin, his eyes reflecting the emerald glow of the screen. He was a professional parasite, the kind who knew that in the upper echelons of Manhattan commerce, paper was the only true reality. But even a parasite gets nervous when $105 million is floating in digital limbo between Zurich and a newly minted Delaware shell company. Garrison, however, possessed none of Vance's professional restraint. The sheer proximity of the wealth had shattered whatever thin veneer of upper-class decorum he had left. His thumb clacked violently against the glass of his iPhone. He wasn't waiting for the funds to settle. He was already spending them. The wire has hit the intermediary clearinghouse in New York, Garrison muttered, his voice thick with a manic, short-circuited energy. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at his mother. He was staring at a digital PDF layout of a triplex penthouse on Biscayne Boulevard. I just texted the broker in Miami. I told him to execute the purchase contract for $24 million. Cash. Closing in 72 hours. Meredith turned from the window, her expression a mix of maternal indulgence and calculating pride. Make sure the deed is registered strictly under Apex Horizons, Garrison. We don't want any domestic asset visibility until the probate court finalizes the broader estate next month. Already ahead of you, Ma? Garrison laughed, a short, ugly sound that lacked any real breath. The broker is sending the digital signature link right now. I'm signing as the sole managing member of Apex. Done. The yacht broker in Fort Lauderdale is next. I told him I want the 80-foot azimuth delivered by Columbus Day. I watched him. I didn't move a muscle. I didn't adjust my posture. I sat there like a statue carved from marble, recording every syllable, every twitch of his jaw. This was the fatal flaw of the greedy heirs. It was a psychological pattern I had studied for 10 years, while managing my father's global logistics portfolios. Wealthy legacy children who have never faced a down cycle don't understand risk. They understand leverage. They understand entitlement. But they don't understand the heavy, crushing mechanics of debt and liability. They look at a bank balance the way a child looks at a pile of candy, totally oblivious to the poison laced into the sugar. Because they held 90% of the voting shares through a temporary estate proxy, they assumed they held absolute power. They assumed that because I was the illegitimate daughter of a legal secretary, I would crawl away into the dark with my Park Avenue penthouse, grateful not to be wearing handcuffs. They were so blinded by the glare of the $105 million that they had completely bypassed the fundamental rule of any high-stakes corporate acquisition: due diligence. They hadn't checked the underlying credit facilities of the Zurich portfolio. They hadn't checked because Arlo Vance had assured them the assets were clean, sovereign treasury notes. And Vance hadn't checked because he was too busy calculating his 5% transaction fee, $5.25 million, wired directly to his private account in the Cayman Islands the moment the primary transfer cleared. "You look remarkably calm, Cressida," Meredith said, stepping toward the table, her pearls clicking softly against her diamond brooch. She stopped 3 feet away from me, looking down with a cold, analytical detachment that would have frozen a weaker woman's blood. "Most people in your position would be weeping. Or calling a defense attorney." "I don't have anyone left to weep for, Meredith," I said, my voice dropping into a quiet, gravelly register that sounded completely hollow. "My father is dead. The company is yours. I'm just waiting for my clearance to be revoked so I can pack my things." "A very sensible attitude," she murmured, turning back to her son. "Garrison, tell the driver we'll be downstairs in 10 minutes. And call Harrison's office. Tell them to initiate the public relations sequence. I want the announcement of your appointment as executive chairman on the Bloomberg terminal by the time the market opens tomorrow morning." "On it," Garrison said, his fingers flying across his phone. "The Biscayne contract is executed. The deposit is locked. We are officially in the deep water now." They had no idea. They didn't know that the Zurich secondary bond portfolio wasn't a standalone asset pool. 2 years ago, when the shipping supply lines collapsed during the European port strikes, my father hadn't used corporate cash to keep Hardin Logistics afloat. He had structured a complex, cross-collateralized credit facility with the European Central Bank. He had pledged those exact Zurich bonds as the primary collateral for a $90 million emergency liquidity loan. But there was a specific lethal covenant hidden on page 84 of that Swiss credit agreement. A clause my father and I had drafted late one night in Zurich while Meredith was in Aspen spending $40,000 a week on ski instructors. The covenant stated that if the Zurich bonds were ever transferred, assigned, or reallocated to a non-regulated foreign entity, such as a Delaware LLC, without a certified 12-month forensic audit signed off by the primary trustee, the entire $90 million credit facility would automatically default. Instant acceleration. Immediate foreclosure. And the kicker? The contract carried an unconditional personal indemnification clause. The moment Garrison signed that transfer agreement as the sole managing member of Apex Horizons LLC, he didn't just inherit $25 million in bonds. He legally, personally assumed the $90 million accelerated liability to the European Central Bank. He had wrapped a financial noose around his own neck, and he was currently celebrating the fit of the rope. 68%, Garrison whispered, his eyes glued to the progress bar. "Come on, baby. Move faster." Arlo Vance tapped his gold signet ring against his leather binder. He looked out at the gray, rain-slicked skyscrapers of Wall Street, completely unaware that his career, his firm, and his freedom were dissolving with every percentage point that ticked. "Cross that screen." "The paperwork is flawless, Meredith," Vance said, his voice carrying the oily reassurance of a lawyer who believed he had outsmarted the system. "Cressida's biometric signature locks the corporate authorization. Even if the federal regulators look at this next quarter, it will appear as a legitimate, internal capital reallocation authorized by the sitting CFO. They won't be able to touch a dime. I looked down at my hands. My knuckles were steady. My breathing was slow, rhythmic, matching the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. They thought they were the predators. They thought they had trapped the secretary's daughter in a room on the 54th floor and stripped her bare. They didn't realize that I hadn't built a wall to keep them out. I had built a maze, and I had spent the last 48 hours guiding them down the exact corridor that led to the slaughterhouse floor. 82%, Garrison yelled, a wild, jagged laugh breaking from his throat. Almost home, Ma. Almost home. The progress bar didn't flash. It didn't trigger a digital fanfare. It simply turned a solid, unchanging emerald green, and the numbers stopped rolling. 100% transfer complete. A split second later, the heavy laserjet printer beneath the credenza chugged to life, drawing a single sheet of clean white paper across its rollers with a rhythmic mechanical hiss. The scent of warm toner and fresh ink leaked into the room. Garrison didn't wait for the page to drop into the tray. He snatched it out mid-cycle, wrinkling the edge. He stared at the transaction number, his eyes darting across the Swiss routing codes. It's confirmed, he whispered, a sharp, ragged breath escaping his lungs. The Delaware clearing account just credited $80 million from the trust and $25 million from Zurich. It's in. It's all in. Meredith closed her eyes for a brief second, inhaling deeply, as if inhaling the scent of the money itself. When she opened them, her expression was completely bare. The mask of the grieving widow was gone. The sophisticated New York socialite was gone. There was only a hard, diamond-sharp malice left underneath. The resignation paperwork, Arlo, Meredith said, her voice striking the mahogany table like a gavel. Let's finalize the extraction. Arlo Vance didn't slide the document this time. He tossed it. The 3-page voluntary resignation and full waiver of corporate claims landed directly in front of me. Attached to it was the deed modification for the Park Avenue penthouse, the small bone they were throwing to the dog to keep it from barking. Sign it, Cressida, Vance instructed, his hand reaching into his pocket to retrieve his fountain pen. The board signature is already executed on our end. You sign, you hand over your security tokens, and you walk out of this building before 5 o'clock. If you're still in the elevator bank at 5:01, security will escort you to the curb. I looked down at the document. My face remained a mask of absolute submission. I picked up my own pen, the cheap black plastic ballpoint I had used since my first day as a junior analyst, not the gold-plated luxury items they flaunted. I just want to be sure, I said, keeping my tone small, vulnerable. A perfect imitation of a woman calculating her remaining survival odds. The Newark audit files. They are completely destroyed. You won't file the grand larceny report with the district attorney. Meredith let out a soft, impatient sigh, checking her diamond-encrusted watch. Cressida, I have a multi-million-dollar real estate closing in Miami to celebrate. I don't have time to chase a penniless bastard across the courts. Sign the paper, take your little apartment and disappear. You have my word. Your word, I repeated softly. Then I smiled. It wasn't a broken smile. It wasn't the trembling grimace of a victim. It was a slow, elegant, terrifyingly calm curving of my lips, the smile of a grandmaster who had just watched her opponent move their king into a 3-move checkmate. I pressed the pen to the paper. I signed my name on the trustee line. Clean. Bold. No hesitation. Before the ink could even dry, Garrison lunged across the table, his hand clawing at the paper, snatching it away as if he expected me to tear it to pieces. He checked my signature, his chest heaving with excitement. She signed it, Ma. She's off the board. She has zero legal standing in Hardin Logistics as of right now. Excellent, Meredith breathed, her fingers tightening around her Chanel purse. Arlo, let's go. We're done here. Actually, a new voice broke the silence. The voice didn't come from me. It came from the far end of the boardroom table. Special Master David Miller, the silent, gray-haired legal overseer appointed by the New York Surrogates Court to monitor the estate's transition, stood up. For the past 3 hours, Miller had sat in the shadows, his yellow legal pad blank, his presence entirely ignored by Meredith and Garrison, who viewed him as nothing more than a bureaucratic rubber stamp. Miller adjusted his spectacles. He didn't look at Meredith. He didn't look at Garrison. He looked directly at Arlo Vance. "Nobody is leaving this room," Miller said. His voice wasn't loud, but it possessed the heavy, undeniable authority of a federal mandate. Vance froze, his briefcase handle halfway up his forearm. His eyebrows knit together, his professional arrogance instantly bristling. "Excuse me, Master Miller? The corporate transfer is fully authorized by the majority shareholders. The CFO has resigned. This meeting is formally adjourned." "This meeting is evidence," Miller corrected him. He reached into his leather portfolio and pulled out a thick, blueback document bearing the gold seal of the state of New York. "Mr. Vance, at 4:30 p.m., exactly 12 minutes ago, Judge Thomas Linwood of the New York Saugus Court executed an emergency, ex parte temporary restraining order, and an immediate asset freeze on all accounts associated with Hardin Logistics, Apex Horizons LLC, and Vance and Associates." The room went entirely violently still. The hum of the air conditioner seemed to die. Outside, the rain lashed against the 54th floor windows with a dull rhythmic thud, but inside, the air became so thick it was impossible to breathe. Garrison's face went white, the manic twitch in his jaw freezing mid-motion. "What the hell are you talking about? The money already cleared. It's in Delaware." "And that, young man, is precisely the problem," Miller said, his tone as cold and analytical as an autopsy report. He opened the blue binder. "Pursuant to Section 11 to 1.7 of the New York Estates, Powers and Trusts Law, any attempt by an executor or trustee to execute an unverified foreign transfer of charitable trust funds constitutes an automatic breach of fiduciary duty." Vance stepped back, his expensive leather shoes squeaking against the hardwood floor. A bead of sweat, thick and oily, formed at his hairline, breaking through his expensive bronzer. "Miller, listen to me. This was a structured capital dividend. It's fully compliant with the regulations." "It is a fraudulent conveyance, Arlo," I interrupted. I didn't whisper. I didn't hide behind a broken tone anymore. My voice rang out through the boardroom, hard, clear, and dripping with an absolute, merciless authority that made Meredith flinch. I stood up, smoothing the front of my blazer. I looked down at Vance, whose hands were now visibly trembling against his briefcase. "You forgot to check the restrictive covenants on the Zurich secondary bond portfolio, Arlo," I said, my words dropping like iron weights. "You were so busy calculating your 5% fee that you didn't look at page 84 of the European Central Bank credit agreement my father signed 2 years ago." Vance's eyes widened, his pupils dilating as his legal brain desperately tried to calculate the missing variable. "The credit facility. That was paid off last fiscal year." "No," I whispered, leaning forward, pressing my hands flat against the mahogany table. "It was cross-collateralized. The moment Garrison signed that transfer agreement as the sole managing member of Apex Horizons, he didn't just move $25 million. He triggered an immediate, automated default clause with the ECB for $90 million in accelerated liabilities. A debt that carries unconditional personal indemnification." Garrison dropped his phone. The glass screen shattered against the edge of the table with a sharp, crystalline crack. Ma, what is she saying? What 90 million? Meredith didn't answer him. She couldn't. She was staring at me, her mouth slightly open, her perfectly applied lipstick looking like a fresh wound on her pale, bloodless face. "But that's just the civil liability," I continued, turning my gaze back to Vance, watching the utter horror slowly paralyze his body. "Master Miller, would you please read the criminal trigger executed by the signature on page 3? Miller nodded, his face grim. The moment the transfer cleared to a non-regulated shell company under the guise of an emergency loan, it legally activated the forfeiture covenant, the bad boy clause, of the primary Pierce Hardin Irrevocable Trust. By signing this document in an attempt to extort the CFO and divert charitable assets, Meredith Hardin and Garrison Hardin have officially, legally, and permanently forfeited 100% of their claims to the Hardin estate. The silence that followed was absolute. Meredith fell back into her chair, her hand flying to her throat, her fingers crushing the South Sea pearls until her knuckles turned a ghostly, bloodless white. She looked at Vance, her eyes wild, her voice a ragged, breathless shriek. "Arlo, do something. Fix this. Tell them it's a mistake." Vance didn't move. He couldn't. He was staring at the small brass frame of the oil painting behind my chair, finally noticing the tiny, unblinking black lens of the camera camouflaged within the molding. The freeze was total. They were trapped inside their own boardroom, suffocating under the weight of the very paper they had used to destroy me. The double oak doors of the boardroom didn't slam. They clicked open with a heavy, pressurized sigh that let in the chilly air of the 54th floor corridor. Two men in charcoal gray overcoats walked in. They didn't look like corporate executives. They had the thick, unblinking presence of federal law enforcement. Between them was Marcus Vance, no relation to Arlo, the lead investigator for the New York office of the FBI's white-collar crime division. Behind them stood two uniformed state troopers, their leather duty belts creaking in the absolute silence of the room. Arlo Vance's hand dropped from his briefcase. The alligator skin looked dull under the fluorescent lights. His jaw didn't drop. It tightened until the tendons in his neck went rigid. He was a criminal defense attorney. He knew exactly what 2 federal badges and a sealed grand jury subpoena meant at 5 o'clock on a Thursday. Arlo, Investigator Vance said, his voice flat, completely stripped of any personal animosity. He laid a piece of paper on the table. It wasn't a corporate motion. It was a federal arrest warrant. 18 U.S.C. Section 1343. Wire fraud. We also have a warrant for Garrison Hardin for grand larceny in the first degree under New York Penal Law. 155.42. Garrison didn't move. He sat staring at the shattered glass of his iPhone on the mahogany table. A thin line of sweat had cut a path through the expensive bronzer on his forehead, pooling at his chin. "The money is in Delaware," he whispered, his voice cracking like a dry stick. "It's a corporate dividend. My lawyer said it was clean." "Your lawyer is going to be your cellmate, Garrison," I said. I leaned down, placing my palms flat on the wood, looking straight into his bloodshot eyes. You see, the Delaware Shell Company wasn't the end of the line. Under the Civil RICO Statute, Title 18, United States Code, Section 1961, the moment you used an interstate wire transfer to tarnish a charitable trust while executing an act of extortion against a corporate officer, it ceased to be a probate dispute. It became a racketeering enterprise. "Cressida, please," Meredith gasped. The Boston drawl was gone. Her voice was thin, reedy, the frantic screech of a woman watching her life jacket sink into deep water. She lunged across the table, her manicured fingers catching the sleeve of my blazer. The South Sea pearls around her neck caught on her diamond brooch, snapping the silk thread. Dozens of perfect iridescent spheres dropped onto the table, clattering against the wood and rolling into the carpet like small, expensive teeth. "We're family, Cressida," she begged, her eyes wide, glassy with terror. Your father wouldn't want this. We can restructure the entire distribution. You can have 60%. 70. Just tell the investigators it was an administrative misunderstanding." I pulled my arm back slowly, deliberately, leaving her fingers clutching empty air. "My father died with his eyes open, Meredith," I said, my voice dropping into a freezing, remorseless whisper. "He spent his last 3 weeks trapped in a bed, unable to speak, watching you sign away his life's work with Arlo's proxies. You didn't give him a 60% option. You didn't give him an administrative misunderstanding. You gave him a cold room and a funeral 3 days later." Investigator Vance stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on Garrison's shoulder. "Mr. Hardin, stand up, please. Keep your hands where I can see them." Garrison didn't stand. He sloped out of the chair, his knees buckling slightly as the state trooper hauled him upright. The metal handcuffs clicked into place with a sharp, double-strike sound that echoed off the glass walls. The Patek Philippe on his wrist caught the light one last time before his sleeve was pulled down. Meredith didn't cry. She sat frozen, watching her son being led toward the door, her face twisting into something ancient and ruined. Arlo Vance was already reading the subpoena, his fingers trembling so violently the paper rattled. He knew the math. Treble damages under civil RICO meant his law firm would be liquidated by the federal government before the winter solstice. His private accounts in the Caymans were already flagged by FinCEN. He was 62 years old. He would die in a federal penitentiary in Pennsylvania, and he knew it. Special Master David Miller closed his blue binder with a soft, final thud. He turned to me and handed me a single black fountain pen, my father's pen, the old Pelican M800 he had used to sign the original incorporation papers of Hardin Logistics 30 years ago. "The forfeiture covenant is fully executed, Ms. Hardin," Miller said, his voice carrying the quiet respect of a man who appreciated perfect legal craftsmanship. "As of 4:45 p.m., you are the 100% sole equity holder of Hardin Logistics, the Hardin Charitable Trust, and all subsidiary real estate holdings. The temporary proxy held by Meredith Hardin is legally void." "Thank you, David," I said. I didn't stay to watch them clear out the room. I didn't want to see Meredith being processed by the state troopers. I picked up my leather briefcase, walked past Arlo Vance without looking at him, and stepped into the private executive elevator. The doors glided shut. The descent was silent. When I stepped out into the lobby of the building, the digital Bloomberg terminal on the wall was already scrolling the news. Hardin Logistics CFO assumes full control amidst federal fraud investigation of Heirs. The market hadn't dropped. It was holding steady. Wall Street preferred stability, and they knew I represented the numbers. I walked through the glass revolving doors into the cool gray Manhattan rain. The air smelled of wet asphalt and exhaust. The real world clean and completely devoid of the sterile poison of that boardroom. In my briefcase sat the documents for a $50 million Keyman life insurance policy my father had taken out 20 years ago, naming me as the sole, irrevocable beneficiary. It was clean money. Insulated from the company, insulated from the probate court, insulated from Meredith's lawyers. It was my foundation. I pulled my umbrella open and looked down the long wet stretch of Park Avenue. The frustrated that had suffocated me for 10 years had washed down the storm drains. I was 34 years old, I was entirely free, and the Hardin Empire belonged to the secretary's daughter. Real justice doesn't happen with a loud gavel or a dramatic scream in a crowded courtroom. It happens in the quiet spaces, between the lines of a contract, where greed writes its own death warrant. If you found yourself backed into a corner by people who thought their wealth made them untouchable, would you have fought them in the mud? Or would you have built the maze and waited for them to lock themselves in? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's discuss how true strategy always outlives raw arrogance. Hit that subscribe button. And don't miss the next breakdown of how the law can be the ultimate weapon.